The Magnolia Table was the kind of restaurant that had earned its reputation the slow and honest way, built over 14 years on the corner of St. Charles Avenue and 7th Street in New Orleans, Louisiana, into a place that locals defended with the particular fierceness that New Orleanians reserve for the things they consider genuinely theirs, not discovered, not transplanted, not curated for a food magazine's annual list of the South's best tables, but grown organically out of the neighborhood itself, fed by the same soil and the same history and the same stubborn insistence on doing things right that had built the city block by block over 3 centuries of flood and fire and reinvention. The restaurant seated 80 on the main floor and another 20 on the covered courtyard patio that looked out onto the garden behind the building, where a fig tree older than the restaurant itself dropped fruit every August that the kitchen's chef, a compact and precise man named Renard, incorporated into a seasonal dessert that regulars planned their late summer visits around. The Magnolia Table had white tablecloths and good wine and a menu that changed with the season and prices that reflected the quality of the ingredients and the seriousness of the kitchen, and it attracted the kind of clientele that dressed for dinner not because the restaurant required it but because they understood without being told that this was a room that deserved to be met with a certain intentionality. It was, by any honest measure, a fine establishment. And like all fine establishments, what happened inside it on any given evening was shaped less by the menu than by the character of the people running the floor. Derek Allen Fontenot was 26 years old and had been working as a server at the Magnolia Table for 2 years and 4 months, long enough to know the menu in the complete and specific way that good servers know menus, not just the dishes but the stories behind them, the sourcing of the ingredients, the way a particular wine moved through the courses of a tasting menu, the questions guests were likely to ask before they asked them. He had grown up in the Treme neighborhood 2 miles from the restaurant, the second of 4 children raised by his mother Celestine, who had worked the breakfast shift at a diner on Canal Street for 21 years and who had taught her children, through the sustained eloquence of her own example, that service was not a lesser form of work but a particular form of dignity, that taking care of people at a table was a craft that rewarded the same qualities as any other craft: attention, consistency, genuine interest in the person in front of you. Derek had absorbed this so completely that it was no longer a lesson he could locate separately from himself. It was simply how he moved through a room, how he read a table, how he spoke to guests who were celebrating something and to guests who were clearly having a difficult evening and needed the meal to be the uncomplicated good thing in an otherwise hard day. He was not the fastest server on the floor. He was the one guests asked for when they called to make a reservation. The floor manager at the Magnolia Table was a man named Philip Garrett Rousseau, 39 years old, who had come up through the hospitality industry on the operational side: numbers, systems, efficiency metrics, labor cost percentages, the management of a dining room as a logistical enterprise rather than a human one. He was not without competence. The floor ran on time under his supervision. Reservations were honored. Complaints were handled before they became reviews. He understood the machinery of a restaurant the way an engineer understands a machine, in terms of its inputs and outputs, its tolerances and its failure points, and within that framework he was genuinely effective. What he lacked, and what he had perhaps never fully possessed, was any instinct for the human dimension of the work, the understanding that a restaurant is not only a system for delivering food but also a space where people come to feel something, cared for, celebrated, restored, and that the quality of that feeling is determined less by the efficiency of the operation than by the character of the individuals running it. Philip Rousseau had strong opinions about the kind of establishment the Magnolia Table was and strong reflexes for protecting what he perceived as its standards, and on a Tuesday evening in late October, when he came around the corner from the service corridor and saw a woman sitting alone at the corner table near the window, those reflexes activated immediately and without the moderating influence of either information or compassion. The woman's name was Adeline Ruth Trosclair, and she was 74 years old, and she had been navigating the city of New Orleans without a fixed address for 8 months, since the rooming house on Magazine Street where she had lived for 11 years had been purchased by a development company and converted into short-term rentals in the space of a single summer, displacing 12 residents with 90 days' notice and the kind of legal efficiency that is entirely within the law and entirely without conscience. Before that she had been a seamstress, had worked alterations for a dry cleaner on Prytania Street for 16 years, had been a member of her church choir, had kept a small and well-tended apartment with a window box of petunias she watered every morning. She had not arrived at her current circumstances through any failure of character or effort or responsibility. She had arrived at them because a set of forces entirely outside her control had moved against her life with the indifference that large financial mechanisms have for the small lives they displace. She had come into the Magnolia table that evening because it was cold outside. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees between noon and 6 o'clock, the kind of drop that October produces in New Orleans when the seasons finally make up their minds. And because she had enough money in her purse from a day of doing small tasks for neighbors in the Garden District to order a bowl of the gumbo she had seen listed on the chalkboard sign outside, and because she was hungry and cold and 4 years old and the restaurant looked warm. She had been seated by a young hostess who had simply seated her, as one seats anyone who comes to a restaurant with the intention of ordering a meal, which is both the correct and the only defensible approach, and she had ordered the gumbo and a piece of cornbread and she was finishing both when Philip Rousseau came around the corner and stopped. He took in Adeline Trosclair at the corner table, her worn coat, the canvas bag on the floor beside her chair, the particular quality of her presence that announced, to anyone looking for it, that she was not the Magnolia table's typical Tuesday evening guest, and something in him that operated faster than thought made a decision before any consciously reasoned assessment had taken place. He crossed the room to her table and leaned down and spoke to her in a voice pitched low enough that it would not carry to adjacent tables but hard enough in its tone that the lowness was not kindness, and he asked, with a directness that stripped away any pretense of hospitality, who had permitted her to be seated in this dining room. Adeline looked up at him calmly, with the particular steadiness of a woman who has lived long enough that the rudeness of strangers has stopped being surprising without ever stopping being painful, and she told him that she had come in from the cold and ordered a meal and paid for it, and she produced the receipt the hostess had given her and placed it on the table between them with a quietness that was itself a form of dignity. Philip looked at the receipt. He looked at Adeline. He straightened up and turned and found Derek at the service station 3 tables away, already watching, and he told Derek in a voice that brooked no discussion to remove the woman's bowl from the table, that the meal was being comped and the woman needed to finish her visit. The phrasing was careful enough to survive a later review, but the meaning was plain. Derek's hands went still on the tray he was holding. The room continued around them, conversations, the soft percussion of silverware, a burst of laughter from the courtyard. He looked at Philip. He looked at Adeline. He carried the bowl away, because he was 26 years old and had rent due and a mother who counted on the money he sent home each month, and the calculation of what he could afford to do in this specific moment was not a simple one, and he made the wrong choice, and he knew it as he made it, and the knowing was its own kind of cost. Adeline Trosclair left the Magnolia table that evening with tears moving quietly down her face, not from self-pity, she was not a self-pitying woman, but from the specific and accumulating weight of being made to feel, again, that she had no legitimate claim on ordinary warmth, that the cold was more her appropriate environment than the inside of a room where food was being served and people were comfortable. She walked out onto St. Charles Avenue and the October air was exactly as cold as she had feared it would be, and she adjusted her coat and she walked. Derek finished his shift at 10:30 and went through the kitchen to the alley behind the restaurant where the leftover food from the evening service was bagged for disposal, the untouched bread from the bread baskets, the soup that hadn't been ordered in sufficient quantity to justify refrigerating the remainder, the sandwiches from the late bar menu that always prepared more than the Tuesday crowd required. He stood in the alley with 2 large bags of food that were going into the dumpster and he thought about Adeline's face. He thought about his mother, who had worked a breakfast shift for 21 years and who had told him once, without drama, that the line between the life you have and the life that could happen to you is thinner than comfortable people prefer to believe. He looked at the bags. He walked around to the front of the building onto St. Charles Avenue and he walked 2 blocks south to the small park where he knew from the past several months that a group of people without housing gathered in the evenings, and he called out to a couple he recognized, a man and a woman, husband and wife, Errol and Diane Batiste, who had been sleeping in the park since June, and he told them he had food, that they should take all of it, and that they should come around to the alley the following night and he would have more set aside. What Derek Allen Fontenot then did, every night for the following 3 weeks, was save whatever remained from the evening service, carefully, deliberately, portioning it into containers he brought from home, setting it aside in the walk-in under his name, and bring it to the alley at the end of his shift, where Errol and Diane Batiste and 4 or 5 others who had learned about the arrangement waited quietly. He did not announce this. He did not document it. He did not tell his co-workers, though 2 of them eventually noticed and said nothing, which was its own form of participation. He simply did it because Adeline's face had done something to him that he could not undo by thinking about it and could only address by acting, and because his mother Celestine had worked a breakfast shift for 21 years and he understood in his body what it meant to be in service to other people's comfort while your own remained provisional. On a Wednesday morning in mid-November, Philip Rousseau reviewed 3 weeks of security footage from the rear alley camera as part of a routine audit of after-hours building activity that the insurance company required quarterly, and he found what Derek had been doing, documented across 22 consecutive nights in the timestamp reliable language of surveillance footage. He called Derek into the office at 11 o'clock that morning and terminated his employment without a warning, without a final paycheck for the 2 weeks outstanding, and without any of the procedural steps the restaurant's own employee handbook specified for terminations not involving gross misconduct, which this, a server giving surplus food to people who were hungry rather than placing it in a dumpster, manifestly was not. The owner of the Magnolia Table was a man named Auguste Delacroix, 61 years old, who had opened the restaurant 14 years ago and who had been in Baton Rouge for a week attending to his mother's estate following her passing and had returned to New Orleans the morning after Derek's termination to find 2 things waiting for him simultaneously: the message from Philip Rousseau informing him of the personnel action taken the previous day, and a notification that a food blogger named Sylvie Marchand, who wrote a widely read column about New Orleans culture called Below the Surface, had published a piece 2 days earlier about what she had personally witnessed happening in the alley behind the Magnolia Table on 3 separate occasions. A young server, she wrote, who had quietly become a one-man food distribution operation for the unhoused community of the Garden District, doing it at the end of long shifts and on his own initiative and with the particular grace of someone who was not performing generosity but simply practicing it. The piece had been shared 11,000 times by the time Auguste Delacroix read it over his morning coffee in the office on the 2nd floor of the restaurant. He read it twice. Then he picked up the file Philip had left on his desk and he read Derek's termination paperwork, and the reason given, and the procedural record of how it had been conducted. He sat quietly for a long time looking at the fig tree in the courtyard below his window, which had dropped its last fruit of the season 2 months ago and stood bare now in the November morning. Then he walked downstairs and into the manager's office where Philip was conducting the morning's administrative work, and he stood in the doorway and he said, in the even and final tone of a man who has made a decision and is simply delivering it rather than discussing it, that he needed Philip to walk him through the reasoning behind terminating a 14-year employee, the restaurant's tenure, not Philip's, for giving surplus food to people experiencing homelessness rather than putting it in a landfill. Philip began to explain about standards and optics and the particular image of the establishment. Auguste listened until Philip had finished. Then he told Philip that his own employment at the Magnolia Table was concluded effective that afternoon, that HR would process the paperwork, and that he should take the rest of the morning to collect his things. Philip Garrett Rousseau left the Magnolia Table on St. Charles Avenue at 12:40 that afternoon, and the door closed behind him with the same plain sound all doors make, which is itself a kind of verdict. Derek Allen Fontenot received a phone call from Auguste Delacroix's assistant that same afternoon, while he was sitting at his kitchen table in the Treme working out how to cover rent with 2 weeks of missing pay and whatever he could pull together from savings. He drove to the restaurant the following morning and sat across from Auguste in the 2nd floor office, and Auguste told him 3 things: that his termination had been reversed, that the outstanding pay would be deposited by end of day, and that the Magnolia Table needed a floor manager. Someone who understood that a restaurant's standards were not threatened by the presence of a hungry woman in a corner booth but were in fact expressed most clearly by how that woman was treated when she arrived. He told Derek that the job was his if he wanted it, and that the only condition attached to it was that he keep doing exactly what he had been doing in the alley, and that the restaurant would formalize and support it, a nightly surplus program, properly organized, in partnership with 2 nonprofits already doing food distribution work in the neighborhood. Derek was quiet for a moment, and then he said yes, and Auguste nodded, and they shook hands across the desk, and below them the fig tree stood bare in the courtyard, patient as it always was, waiting for August. The instinct to help, the one that moves in you before the calculation catches up, the one that knows what is right before you have fully talked yourself into it, that instinct is worth protecting. It is worth the risk it sometimes asks of you. Derek Fontenot lost his job for feeding hungry people with food that was going into a dumpster, and the world looked at that and called it wrong, loudly enough and clearly enough that the right person heard it and responded accordingly. You may not always have an Auguste Delacroix waiting to see the footage. But you will always have the knowledge of what you did and why you did it, and that knowledge is a foundation that no one can terminate and no system can audit away. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that doing what is kind and doing what is right are almost always the same thing, and that the world, at its best, has a way of finding out.